I still remember the way my heart felt like it was lodged in my throat when I realized something was wrong. We had just arrived at the villa, a sprawling whitewashed suite nestled on a cliff overlooking the cerulean blue of the Aegean Sea, and I was halfway through untying the straps on my suitcase when there was a knock at the door. I assumed it was room service or perhaps a late offer of champagne from the hotel staff. Meera giggled and rose from the bed, where she'd already begun unpacking her dresses, silk slips in blush tones, and a lightweight cardigan that fluttered whenever the sea breeze drifted through the open terrace doors. She didn't sound worried. She sounded delighted, as though the knock itself might be part of some grand, romantic surprise she'd orchestrated for our honeymoon. I expected a bottle of Dom Perignon or 2 flutes frosted with condensation. Instead, the door swung open to reveal a man whose face I had only ever seen in photographs. Gerald Lennox, Meera's father. He stepped into the room wearing a crisp linen shirt, untucked but neatly pressed, and khaki trousers rolled up at the ankle. In his hand, he clutched a small duffel bag, already packed, as though he'd anticipated this very moment, and his eyes danced with a triumphant gleam that made me realize he'd known every detail of our honeymoon plans. "You really thought I'd stay home?" he chirped, as though he'd interrupted the most ordinary afternoon rather than the beginning of our married life. The way he surveyed the room, taking in the scattered, unpacked suitcases, the half-peeled welcome fruit basket, the thrown-back hotel towels, was as though he owned every square inch of that space and everyone in it. My blood chilled, and for an instant I felt as though the walls were closing in. Meera stood beside him, leaning into her father's side, her laughter like a bell in the quiet of the suite. "He's just worried," she said, as though understanding why my face had gone pale and my hands had begun to tremble. "You worry too much, dear," she whispered, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. She smiled at me, and I wanted to reach across the room and kiss her until the world righted itself. But then her father spoke again, and any warmth I felt drained away, leaving me numb. He dropped his bag by the entryway, as if setting down the tools of his own design. He surveyed me with the faintest smirk, as though daring me to protest his presence. "I suppose I ought to introduce myself properly to my son-in-law," he said, stepping forward. I swallowed against the dryness of my throat, the words lodging in my chest before I could force them out. "Mr. Lennox, I began, voice cracking, but he cut me off with a single wave of his hand, as though dismissing a minor inconvenience. "Please, call me Gerald. We're family, are we not?" His tone was deceptively casual, as though he'd merely come to ensure his daughter had enough towels, enough pillows, enough anything to keep her comfortable. But everyone who looked at him, Meera included, knew that was not the case. He saw her as the one treasure in his life, and everyone else as an afterthought. "I thought our honeymoon was going to be ours." My voice was low, shaking, and I could see a flicker of confusion pass across Meera's face before she looked away, eyes darting toward her father's steadfast posture. "Honeymoon," she repeated, as though tasting the word for the first time. "Of course it is," she said, reaching for my hand. I let her take it, but my skin felt cold where her fingers brushed. "You just look so happy. I wanted to be part of the moment," Gerald explained, unabashed, as though his presence somehow enhanced the sanctity of a trip meant solely for the two of us. My mind raced back to the moment I first met Meera, 4 years ago at that conference in Austin. She was witty and vibrant, and I'd fallen for her quick smile the second she turned toward me and asked a question about the speaker's opening remarks. I hadn't known then that her father was always close by, following her to breakfast, calling 3 times a day, handling her finances, all in the name of protection. Back then, I'd convinced myself that he was simply a concerned widower who wanted the best for his only daughter. I told myself his involvement was love, and I was naive enough to believe it. But standing now in our honeymoon suite, my honeymoon suite, listening to him announce he was essentially our shadow for the next 30 days, something inside me snapped. Meera's laughter echoed, a sound that used to make my chest ache with longing and delight. Now it sounded brittle, too bright and brittle to be anything but a defense mechanism. "Dad, give him a break," she said, stepping closer to her father. "I told him you might stop by. He's just surprised." Surprise. Right. A father's surprise was to flop himself onto our bed as though it were his personal recliner, adjust the pillows, and demand towels like he ran the place. "I could have sworn we booked a suite that sleeps too," I said, doing my best to keep my voice steady. "Good," Gerald replied, a glint in his eye. That's exactly what we have here. My stomach twisted, and I realized I wanted nothing more than to leave Santorini behind and escape that room. But I'd come here to celebrate our union. I'd come here believing that for once, every expectation would be ours to set together. Instead, I'd woken up next to a stranger who was already stocking his side of the closet with his shirts and slacks. Meera exchanged a sideways glance with her father, then placed a hand on his arm as though to guide him through this landscape that was supposed to be sacred to us both. He knows you love him, she said to her father, her voice soft as sea breeze. And I love him, too. She turned to face me, a small tremble in her expression that I'd never seen before. For a moment, I thought maybe this was her way of tempering her father's intrusion, like somehow her affection for me would make him step back. But then he chuckled, as if sharing some private joke with the universe. Of course she does. She tells me all the time. He took a step closer, eyes never leaving mine. But you'll learn to share her, son, because I won't be leaving. I felt a wave of nausea, and I blinked hard to force myself not to show weakness. I see, I said, though I saw nothing but betrayal. I stumbled backward as though the room itself had shifted on its axis. All I could think was, she knew. She let him do this. I could taste the salt of the sea on my lips when I glanced at the balcony, as if the horizon beyond was calling me to freedom. But to go out there without resolving this was to abandon our marriage before it truly began. Still, I couldn't stand by and let him relegate me to some secondary role in my own relationship. So I took a steadying breath, squared my shoulders, and walked toward the closet, where Gerald was already selecting a shirt from one of the hangers. Your towel's over there. He nodded toward a stack folded neatly on a marble shelf. Extra pillows, too. If I'm keeping her comfortable, I might as well do everything by the book. Meera let out a nervous laugh and touched his arm, looking at me with eyes that once invited me into her world. Now they felt hollow, as though she were only going through the motions of being a bride. That realization hit me like a cold wave. This wasn't a honeymoon. It was a political maneuver, a drama in which I was merely a prop and Gerald was the director. My chest ached. I felt hollowed out. Every dream I'd harbored about building a future with Meera on some secluded beach, just the two of us, had evaporated the moment he stepped into the room. I clenched my fists and found my voice swallowing hard before I could control the tremor. I want to talk to you alone, I said, gesturing for Meera to leave. She hesitated, looking at her father for approval. He raised an eyebrow and shrugged. Be my guest, he said before turning back to hang his trousers. I took Myra's hand gently and guided her toward the bathroom, feeling her warmth against my skin, but knowing I'd already lost the warmth between us. Inside the bathroom, she closed the door and pressed her back against it, running her fingers through her hair. Her eyes were damp with unshed tears. Why won't you just let him in? She whispered. Her question was like a knife to my chest. Let him what? I asked, trying to keep my voice level. Be part of our honeymoon? I told him to stay home, Jace. I meant it. But her father had had other plans, and she'd known that from the beginning. My vision blurred as anger and hurt collided. You knew he was coming, I said, not as a question, but as an accusation. But you didn't think to warn me. She stared at me as though I'd lost my mind. He's the only family I have, she said softly. I can't just tell him no. The words hung in the air, and I realized then that Myra's loyalty had always been split between us and her father. I took the single moment I needed to steady my breathing before stepping back into the bedroom. Gerald stood by the balcony doors, drank half his beer, and watched the sun dip toward the horizon. He smiled at me, that same smirk that said he'd won. I trust you'll behave, he said, his tone patronizing but somehow oddly calm. After all, you're his son-in-law now. Something inside me broke at that phrase, his son-in-law. It was as though my identity had already been transferred to a role I'd never auditioned for. I felt naked, stripped of any agency I'd thought I possessed the day I asked Meera to marry me. But no matter the pain, I resolved right then that this marriage would not be dictated by her father's whims. I took a step forward, met his gaze, and let my voice be heard despite the anger roiling in my chest. I will not be your son-in-law. His face froze for the briefest instant, shock, maybe, that I dared defy him. Meera let out a short, brittle laugh, as though this were the most absurd thing she'd ever heard. But Gerald just looked at me with cold disdain before turning and walking to the minibar, his presence still looming larger than life. In that moment, I knew I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. Our honeymoon, even more importantly, our marriage, had begun not as a union between two people but as a standoff, me against her father. The first day of my married life was the day I discovered my bride's true allegiance. My heart pounded so loud I could only focus on a single thought: I would not let this stand. I would find a way to reclaim our marriage and make it mine and hers, or I would walk away entirely. But for now, I was trapped in a room with a stranger calling himself my father-in-law, and the woman I'd promised everything to was standing by his side. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and prepared for the longest 30 days of my life. I first saw Meera Lennox at a conference in Austin, standing by the registration table with a glass of sparkling water and a portfolio in her hand, chatting easily with two women who couldn't seem to look away from her. She had that way of commanding a room. Every word that left her lips felt intentional, every smile honed to perfection. I was just another guy in line for a name badge, feeling out of place in a rented suit that didn't quite fit. But when I heard her laugh, a low, melodic sound that didn't seem to belong in a place full of spreadsheets and sales charts, I couldn't look anywhere else. It wasn't that she was the most beautiful woman in the room, though she certainly turned heads. It was that she seemed untouchable and approachable all at once, the kind of woman who made you want to know what it would take to make her look at you the way she looked at everyone else. I don't remember what I said to her first, something about the conference schedule, maybe, or the catering, but I remember how she tilted her head slightly, eyes crinkling at the corners, and replied with a warmth that made me feel seen. It was the first time in a long time that I'd felt like someone wanted to listen. We spent the afternoon ducking out of sessions and finding excuses to linger by the coffee stands, laughing at the stale cookies and the dried-out pastries. She told me about her work in event management, how she thrived on orchestrating every detail, and I told her about my background in consulting. By the time the closing speaker droned on about market share, I'd forgotten the reason I'd come to Austin in the first place. I'd found something better. We met again a week later, this time on purpose, in a little cafe with chalkboard menus and a barista who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Meera arrived late, her hair still damp from a morning workout, and ordered a latte with extra foam. She smelled like lavender and sunshine. I remember thinking that was the best combination of scents I'd ever known. We talked about everything and nothing, and I felt like I'd known her for years instead of days. But then, halfway through her coffee, her phone rang. She pulled it out and sighed, rolling her eyes. "Sorry, it's my dad. He worries if I don't check in." She answered, her tone warm, affectionate even, but I couldn't help noticing how the conversation shifted her entire posture, shoulders drawn tight, lips pressed together. It was like a script she'd memorized. "Yes, Dad. I'm fine. I'm with a friend. We're just having coffee," she said, her eyes flicking to mine, then away. I didn't think much of it then. Protective father, I thought. A widower, maybe. Someone who'd invested too much of himself into his only daughter. I told myself it was sweet, even admirable. But then came the second date. She'd invited me to an art exhibit, her idea of fun. And I'd gone because I wanted to see that glow in her face again, the one that lit up whenever she was excited about something. I was waiting near the entrance when she arrived, her hair curled and her dress flowing like a summer breeze. She smiled, that same smile that had hooked me in Austin, and then, like a bad punchline, her father appeared. Gerald Lennox. He was taller than me by a few inches, gray hair slicked back, wearing a navy blazer that probably cost more than my rent. He extended his hand with a politician's practiced confidence, his grip firm, his eyes cold. "So you're the man taking my daughter out tonight," he said, and though his smile was polite, I could feel the challenge behind it. Meera looked apologetic, but she didn't send him away. He stayed for 20 minutes, chatting like he'd known me for years, asking questions that were too pointed to be casual. "What do you do, son? How much do you make exactly? Your family, where are they from?" Meera tried to laugh it off, but I could see the way she clung to his every word, as though his approval was the only currency that mattered. We'd barely left the exhibit when he called her again. She didn't ignore it. She answered, and I watched the way her face shifted, smile fading, eyes cast downward, voice dropping to a hush. "Yes, Dad. Yes, I know. No, he's fine." I told myself again that it was protective, that she was all he had. A widower, I reminded myself. He'd raised her alone, probably had to shoulder everything for years. It made sense, didn't it? But then came the apartment. I was picking her up for dinner 6 months in. We were comfortable enough that she let me in with a spare key. I knocked twice and stepped inside, and there he was, sitting at her kitchen counter with a beer in hand, feet propped on the rungs of the stool like he owned the place. He grinned at me. "Hey there, kid," he said. Kid. I was 29. A year older than Meera. I'd built my own career, paid my own rent, balanced my own bank accounts. But to him, I was a child trespassing on his territory. I felt it every time he called me that, like he'd reduced me to a bystander in my own relationship. And Meera? She didn't even flinch. She kissed his cheek and started making dinner like it was the most natural thing in the world. I tried to protest, but she brushed it off. "He likes to check in," she said. "He's protective." Protective, I repeated to myself. It had become my mantra. I let that word excuse every intrusion, every late-night phone call, every time she canceled plans with me to drive across town and meet him for lunch. I tried to be patient, to understand. I told myself it was the price of loving someone who'd lost a parent young, who'd only had one anchor in the world. I told myself I could handle it because I loved her. And I did. God help me, I loved her with everything I had. But the more time passed, the more I realized that her father wasn't just checking in. He was checking up. He called her every night, every morning, every time she posted something online. He asked where she'd been, what she'd eaten, who she'd seen. He knew her bank account balances. He knew the passwords to her emails. He'd paid off her student loans without telling her. A gift, he said. A way of helping her get ahead. But what he'd really done was tighten the leash, making sure she couldn't move an inch without him noticing. It was the way he'd say my name, too, never quite right, never quite warm. "So, how's our boy Jace today?" he'd ask, like I was a dog he'd adopted on a trial basis. Sometimes he'd wink at me, as though I were in on the joke, but I never was. The worst part was that Meera never saw it. She loved him. I could see that, and I wanted to respect that love. But every time I tried to talk to her about it, every time I hinted that maybe he was a little too involved, she'd shrink away, eyes down, voice quiet. "He's all I have," she'd whisper. "You can't ask me to push him away." And I never wanted to be the villain, so I'd shut up, telling myself it would change when we were married. I thought a ring would make her mine in a way he couldn't touch. I thought the vows would draw a boundary he'd finally respect. But now, looking back on it, I see that he was never planning to let go. The wedding was just another stage for his performance, a place where he could stand next to me and call me kid, where he could remind me, in front of everyone, that I was marrying into his family, not the other way around. And I played my part like a fool. I smiled and shook his hand and let him give the speech about how no one would ever love Meera like her father did. I didn't realize then that he meant that as a warning. A declaration of ownership. And I thought love would be enough to overcome it. But as I stood in that hallway, clutching the remnants of what was supposed to be my marriage, I realized that Gerald Lennox had always planned to be the third person in our relationship. The question was, would I let him stay? When I proposed to Meera, I imagined that the next phase of our lives would belong to us alone. I'd spent weeks planning every detail. The ring, the restaurant, the perfect moment to ask her to be mine. I thought that this was the step that would finally separate her life from her father's, that by marrying her, I would become her family and he would fade into the background. I didn't realize then that I was stepping straight into a trap, one that Gerald Lennox had been setting for years. It started the day after she said yes. I'd barely caught my breath from the high of her smile and the tears in her eyes when I proposed on that rooftop restaurant overlooking the skyline. I'd ordered the champagne and felt like the world had finally aligned for us. But then she excused herself to call her father. Not me, not her best friend, her father. I watched her step aside with her phone pressed to her ear, her face lit by the city lights. I saw her smile, the way her mouth moved as if she were still the girl he'd raised, still the daughter who couldn't make a decision without his approval. And in that instant, I knew some part of her would always belong to him. I told myself it was just a moment, that it was normal to call your family after something so big. But that night, as I lay in bed beside her, her phone buzzed at midnight with a message, "Proud of you, princess. Let's plan the big day soon." She smiled at the screen, and I realized that in his mind, this wedding wasn't just ours. It was his production. In the weeks that followed, he called every day with ideas. Venues, menus, guest lists, details I hadn't even considered yet. At first, I tried to be polite, telling him we'd discuss it as a couple. I thought it was the right thing to do. But then he started booking things without asking us. A catering company confirmed via email with Mr. Lennox that he'd arranged the dinner menu. I hadn't even seen the proposal. When I called Meera, she was at her father's house, working on the seating chart. He just wants to help, she said. He's paying for a lot of it, Jace. Let him be involved. I felt like I was being squeezed out of my own wedding, like my name was on the invitation, but my voice had been silenced. I tried to talk to Meera, to make her see. This is our day, I said, desperation in my voice. It's supposed to be about us, not him. But she only sighed, her shoulders slumping like a child who'd disappointed a parent. He's just excited, she said. He doesn't mean to overshadow us. But he did. He meant to overshadow me. Every time I pushed back, Myra's eyes would go wide, her lips trembling. Please, she'd say, don't fight with him. He's all I have. And that sentence would end every argument. Because how do you argue with that? How do you fight a ghost? The absence of a mother that left him as the only parent she'd ever known? I told myself to be patient, that once we were married, he'd fade into the background. I told myself that Meera would see that I was the one who would be there for her, that she'd realize the truth, that the man she'd agreed to marry should be the one she leaned on now. But every time I thought we were making progress, he'd show up and derail everything. A month before the wedding, I found out he'd changed the venue. Meera and I had chosen a small, rustic barn in the countryside, somewhere quiet, just us and a few close friends and family. We wanted simplicity, but Gerald had other ideas. He booked a ballroom at a luxury hotel downtown, a place so expensive that even the deposit made my stomach lurch. I only found out when the planner called to confirm the floral arrangements. I was stunned. You must have the wrong person, I said, my voice cracking. We're getting married at Windridge Barn. She paused, her tone confused. I'm sorry, Mr. Lennox, she said. The father of the bride confirmed the change last week. That night I confronted Meera. She was at her apartment, her face bathed in the glow of her laptop screen. When I told her, she looked up, her eyes filled with worry. Jace, she said softly. Dad thought it would be easier this way. He said he'd take care of the deposit. We can't afford Windridge without him. My heart twisted. But that was supposed to be our choice, I said. I don't want a wedding that feels like his victory lap. But Meera just sighed, the same way she always did when her father's name came up. Please, she whispered. Don't make me choose. In that moment, I saw the truth she'd already chosen. Maybe she didn't even realize it, but she'd let him infiltrate every part of her life. And now he was planting himself at the center of ours. On the day of the wedding, I tried to brace myself. I stood at the altar, my hands shaking, trying to focus on Myra's face as she walked down the aisle. But even that moment wasn't ours. Gerald insisted on giving her away, insisted on making a speech that went on for 12 minutes. I counted every second, every word that felt like a nail in the coffin of the day I'd dreamed of. No one will ever love Meera the way her father does, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I stood there, frozen, as he reached for her hand and squeezed it like he was reminding me that she was still his. When Meera reached me, she looked beautiful, hair curled, eyes shining. But even as she smiled, I saw the way her eyes flickered to her father, like she was seeking his approval, like she couldn't quite let go of the man who'd hovered over every moment of her life. I tried to push the thought away as we exchanged vows, but I could feel him there, standing behind us, an invisible second groom at the altar. And it wasn't just symbolic. He literally stood beside us as we said our vows, his presence like a cold shadow on my shoulder. I felt like I was getting married to both of them, like no matter what words I spoke, I'd never be the only man in her life. That night, at the reception, he danced with her 5 times before I even had a chance to hold her in my arms. He made toasts that turned the night into a show. He called me her +1 to her friends. And Meera? She smiled and laughed and touched his arm, as if she didn't even notice how wrong it all felt, as if this was normal. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that maybe this was just how some families worked. But every time I looked at her and saw the way she deferred to him, how every decision was made with his approval in mind, I knew I was losing her. When the night finally ended, I watched as she kissed his cheek before she kissed mine. My heart broke a little in that moment, because it felt like he was the one she'd always come back to, like I was just a placeholder in a story that had started long before I'd arrived. And as I held her hand, I felt the cold truth settle over me. I'd married her, but I'd also married him. And no matter how hard I tried, I didn't know if I'd ever be enough to make her see that our marriage should be ours alone. I remember the tremor in my voice when I finally whispered the words, "I do." I practiced them in the mirror, hoping that by the time I stood at the altar with Meera, they'd come out strong and unwavering. But in that moment, with her father's eyes fixed on me from the front row, and, I swear, even from the altar itself, I felt like I was signing a contract with both of them. My hands were cold, and my palms felt clammy against hers. She looked radiant in that ivory gown, her eyes shining with a softness that had once belonged to us alone. But today, I saw something different, a shadow in her gaze, a question she hadn't dared to ask me yet. It was as though she was already bracing herself for the impossible task of splitting herself between the two men in her life. When the officiant asked me to repeat my vows, my voice cracked on the first line. I glanced at Gerald, who stood close enough that I could see the faint smirk playing on his lips. He positioned himself so that he was part of the ceremony, as though the vows couldn't be spoken without his approval. I hated that I noticed him, but I couldn't look away. He was everywhere. His cologne mingling with the scent of Meera's perfume, his voice echoing in my head every time I tried to imagine what our marriage would look like without him. Meera didn't seem to notice. She smiled at me with a sweetness that felt real, but when her father's hand rested on her shoulder, just for a second, her entire posture shifted. It was so subtle that only someone who loved her would have caught it, but I did. It was like watching a flower shrink back into its stem, as if he was reminding her of his presence even on her wedding day. At the reception, I tried to hold on to the belief that the day was still ours, that after the vows, we'd reclaim what we'd promised each other. But it didn't take long for the day to slip through my fingers like sand. Gerald's voice boomed over the speakers as he gave his speech, a 12-minute epic about how no one would ever love Meera the way her father did. Every time he said, "My daughter," I felt like he was staking a claim, planting a flag in the middle of the room that read, "Mine." When he finally stopped talking, the room fell into an awkward silence. People clapped politely, some with genuine smiles, but I saw the looks they gave me like they weren't sure whose wedding it really was. Meera's eyes glistened as she hugged him tightly, thanking him for his words. I stood there, hands hanging uselessly at my sides, wondering when it had become acceptable to overshadow a wedding with a father's possessiveness. When the music started and guests began to dance, I tried to take her hand, but Gerald intercepted her first. He led her onto the dance floor with a practiced ease, holding her close in a way that felt too intimate. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just a father-daughter dance, but he didn't let go after one song. He danced with her 5 times before I even got a chance to hold her close. Each time he guided her across the dance floor, he shot me a look that said, "Remember your place." "And Meera?" She smiled and laughed and threw her head back as though this was the most natural thing in the world. I stood at the edge of the room, watching my wife, lean her head on her father's shoulder, whispering things I would never hear. My stomach twisted with a mixture of jealousy and disbelief. I wanted to grab her hand and pull her away, but every time I tried, she'd smile at me, her eyes pleading. "Just let him have this moment," she'd say. "He's so proud of me." I wanted to ask her, when would I get a moment that was mine? Later that night, when most of the guests had left and the band was packing up, I found Meera by the bar, sipping on a glass of white wine. Her hair was falling loose around her shoulders, and her lipstick had faded from hours of talking and smiling and kissing relatives. She looked tired but content. I approached her, trying to find the right words, but before I could speak, she reached for my hand. "Thank you," she said softly, "for making this day so perfect." I wanted to tell her it wasn't perfect, that it felt like it hadn't even been ours. But when she looked at me like that, eyes wide, lips trembling, I couldn't bring myself to ruin her happiness. I forced a smile and nodded, hoping she couldn't see the crack forming in my heart. We left the venue together, walking hand in hand toward the car. I was trying to remember that this was supposed to be the start of our forever, the night we'd finally be alone. But as we reached the exit, Gerald appeared, blocking the path with a wide grin. "You two looked amazing tonight," he said, his voice thick with pride. "You made your old man proud." Meera beamed, leaning in to hug him. He held her longer than necessary, his eyes flicking to mine over her shoulder. "Take care of her," he said, his voice dropping to a warning tone that made my blood run cold. I wanted to snap back, to remind him that she was my wife now, that she'd chosen me. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because even as I tried to imagine a life with Meera that didn't include him, I saw the way her eyes glistened when he spoke. I saw the way her shoulders relaxed when he was near. And I realized that this wasn't just my wife I'd married. It was her father, too. On the drive to the hotel, Meera rested her head on my shoulder and sighed. "Wasn't it perfect?" she murmured. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "It was beautiful," I said. But in the darkness of that car, I wondered whose wedding it had really been. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Gerald's face. His smirk, his hand on her shoulder, his voice echoing in my head. I wondered if I'd ever be able to shake him from our lives. I wondered if Meera even wanted to. When we reached the hotel, Meera turned to me, eyes full of love. "This is our night," she whispered. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that she'd chosen me, that this was the beginning of our story. But even as I leaned in to kiss her, I felt Gerald's presence like a shadow in the room, reminding me that no matter how hard I tried, I would never be the only man in her life. And in that moment, I wondered if the vows I'd spoken at the altar had already been broken, not by me, but by the invisible hand that had guided every step of her life. I closed my eyes, kissed her, and hoped that somehow, somewhere in this mess, we'd find a way to be just us. But deep down, I knew the battle had only begun. 3 hours. That's all the time we had before he showed up. 3 hours in the Santorini honeymoon suite that was supposed to be ours, the beginning of everything we'd promised each other. Meera and I had barely finished unpacking. Her wedding dress was draped carefully over the back of a chair, her perfume still clinging to the air like the last remnant of the day we'd both sworn would belong to us. I was sorting through the room service menu, deciding what to order for our first meal as husband and wife, when the knock came. Soft but certain, like someone who didn't feel the need to wait for permission to enter. I remember how my stomach clenched, an instinctive warning that everything was about to change. I looked at Meera, hoping she'd show the same confusion or concern that I felt. But she didn't. Instead, she smiled and said, "I'll get it." She moved across the room with a grace I'd always admired, but something in the way she reached for the door felt rehearsed, too easy. The door swung open, and there he was, Gerald Lennox, her father, holding a suitcase that looked suspiciously like it had been packed days ago. "You really thought I'd stay home?" he said, stepping into the suite like it was his private vacation spot. The words hit me like a punch in the chest. I'd known he was possessive, but I'd never imagined he'd take it this far. Meera let out a small laugh, the kind that was meant to soften the edges of a situation but only made my blood boil. "Dad just worries," she said, her voice light, like this was a misunderstanding. But I saw it then. The way she stepped aside to let him in, the way her hand hovered near his arm, like she was welcoming him, like he belonged there as much as I did. My mind raced. This was supposed to be our honeymoon. Ours. And here he was, standing in the doorway with his bag in hand, eyes darting around the suite like he was scoping out his territory. Gerald dropped his suitcase by the bed, our bed, and turned to me with that same smirk I'd come to hate. "Hope you don't mind, son," he said. Son. He always said it like an insult, like a reminder that I was playing a role he'd written. "I thought I'd join you for a few days, just to make sure my girl's comfortable." He glanced at Meera, and she smiled, an expression so gentle it made me want to scream. "She's all I have," he said, like that was enough to excuse every line he'd crossed. I couldn't speak. My throat felt dry, and my hands were trembling. I tried to imagine a world where this was normal, where fathers showed up unannounced on their daughter's honeymoon and made themselves at home. But no matter how I turned it around in my mind, I couldn't make it make sense. "Gerald," I managed to say, my voice low, struggling for calm. This is supposed to be for us. Meera and me." He chuckled, as though I'd told the world's funniest joke. "Oh, I know, son. I won't be in the way. I'll just hang out for a few days, see the sights. She's my princess, after all. You wouldn't want her to be alone here without family, would you?" I looked at Meera, begging for her to say something, to tell him no, to remind him that this was our time. But she only looked at me, her eyes a mix of apology and acceptance. "It's just a few days," she said softly. "He's excited. He's never been to Santorini. Like that was supposed to make it okay. Like I was supposed to just roll over and let him invade every space that should have belonged to us." He moved further into the suite, picking up the welcome champagne and popping the cork like it was his own celebration. Foam spilled onto the table, and he laughed, holding the bottle out like an offering. "Let's toast," he said. "To family." I felt like the walls were closing in. Meera took a glass and raised it, her eyes fixed on me. To family, she echoed, her voice trembling. I stood there, frozen, watching the two of them toast to a future I'd never agreed to. I didn't raise my glass. I couldn't, because in that moment, I knew what he was really celebrating. His victory, his triumph over me. This wasn't about family. This was about control. He wheeled his suitcase into the corner like he was claiming his territory, asking where the minibar was, then telling me to order extra towels. Like I was hotel staff. Meera giggled, covering her mouth, but I saw it, the way she glanced at him for approval, like a child who needed permission. I felt a heat rising in my chest, a fury I hadn't known I was capable of. This was supposed to be our honeymoon, a time to build memories. But all I could see was the way he'd turned our first night together into another one of his conquests. I walked to the balcony, gripping the railing until my knuckles went white. The sea stretched out before me, endless and blue, a place I'd once imagined would be our escape from the world. But now, even here, he'd found a way in. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe, but every inhale felt like it carried his scent, his voice, his presence. I heard them inside. Meera helping him unpack his shirts. His shirts. In our honeymoon suite. I felt a shiver run down my spine. This wasn't just about him being overprotective. This was about him refusing to let go, about him making sure that no matter where we went, he was always there between us. I turned back inside, my heart pounding. He was leaning against the dresser, a beer in hand, smiling like he'd won some secret war. "Don't worry, son," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You'll get used to sharing her." My vision went white at the edges, my hands balling into fists at my sides. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw him out, to tell him to get the hell out of our lives. But then I looked at Meera, my wife, and I saw the way her eyes darted between us, the silent plea for me to keep the peace. I felt my rage fracture into 1,000 pieces. She wouldn't fight him. She wouldn't choose me. Not now. Maybe not ever. I turned away, the weight of that realization pressing on my chest like a vice. This was supposed to be the beginning of everything, our forever. But in that room, with Gerald's shirts in the closet and his laughter in the air, I realized I'd walked into a war I'd never win. I'd married a woman whose heart was still shackled to her father's, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't be both her husband and her father's son-in-law. Not like this. Not with him here, reminding me at every turn that he'd always come first. The night pressed in around me, heavy with the scent of salt and broken promises. I stared at the sea and wondered how the hell I was going to survive 30 days with a man who'd already claimed everything I thought was mine. I stood on the balcony for what felt like an eternity, my breath fogging up the glass door every time I exhaled. The air felt thick with salt and heartbreak, the sea breeze brushing against my skin as if trying to carry away the anger and betrayal that had wrapped itself around my chest. Meera's laughter drifted through the open doorway, light, airy, like this was just another vacation, another night at home with her father. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to scream, to demand she send him away. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. She'd let him in without a second thought, and that realization burned through me like acid. When I finally turned to face them, my pulse was a hammer in my throat. Meera was helping him hang his shirts, in the wardrobe that was supposed to hold our clothes, our memories. I watched as she smoothed the fabric, her hands gentle, her eyes soft, like a daughter caring for her aging father instead of a wife forging a life with her husband. Gerald leaned back against the dresser, a beer in hand, looking like he owned the place. His smirk widened when he saw me standing there. The groom emerges," he said, lifting his bottle in a mocking toast. "Hope you don't mind, son. She's always been my little helper." The way he said it, my little helper, felt like a slap, like a reminder that she'd always be his before she was ever mine. I couldn't stand it. My hands were shaking, rage bubbling under my skin. "Gerald," I said, my voice low but firm. "This is our honeymoon. You weren't supposed to be here." He shrugged, unconcerned. "And yet here I am," he said. "Life's full of surprises, isn't it?" I wanted to hit him, to wipe that smug grin off his face. But when I looked at Meera, my Meera, I saw nothing but conflict in her eyes. She wanted me to accept this. She wanted me to pretend this was normal. And that hurt more than any punch he could have thrown. Gerald cracked open another beer and settled into the armchair by the window. "Don't worry, son," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. You'll get used to sharing her. Those words slammed into me with the force of a freight train. Sharing her. Like she was a toy. Like she was property. My chest felt like it might cave in. I turned to Meera, my voice trembling but sharp. Is this what you wanted? I asked. To share our marriage with him? She blinked, her lips parting, but no sound came out. I could see the tears gathering in her eyes, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. Not now. Not when every part of me felt like it was shattering. I reached up and yanked the wedding band from my finger, the metal cold and heavy in my palm. I stepped toward her, closing the distance that felt like a mile. I placed the ring in her trembling hand, my fingers brushing hers for what might have been the last time. Then you'd better marry him, I whispered, my voice breaking on the last word. Her eyes widened, her lips quivering, but she didn't move. She didn't reach for me. She just stood there, frozen, like she'd been caught between two worlds and couldn't decide which one to choose. I turned away before the tears in her eyes could pull me back. I walked past Gerald, who let out a low whistle like he was watching a movie. That's a bit dramatic, don't you think? He said. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I needed to get out before I lost what was left of my pride. I made it to the door, my heart pounding in my ears. Every step felt like I was walking away from the life I'd dreamed of, the life I'd built in my head. But I couldn't stay. Not like this. I opened the door, stepping into the hallway, the air cooler but no less suffocating. My ears were ringing, my chest tight, every breath a battle. I hit the elevator button, my finger trembling. The seconds stretched into hours. I wanted her to come after me, to grab my hand and tell me she'd made a mistake. I wanted her to choose me. But behind me, the suite remained silent. No footsteps. No apology. Just the distant sound of Gerald's laughter and Meera's muffled tears. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby with a trembling hand. The ride down felt endless. Each floor ticked by like a countdown to the end of everything I thought I knew about love. I stared at my reflection in the mirrored walls, pale, broken, eyes that looked like they belonged to a stranger. The doors were almost closed when I heard her voice, faint but desperate. Wait, Jace, please. The sound of my name on her lips nearly shattered me. I wanted to run back, to hold her, to forgive her. But I couldn't. I couldn't unsee the way she'd stood there, silent, while her father claimed our life. I couldn't forget the way she'd let him in without a second thought. As the elevator descended, I pressed my forehead against the cool metal, my breath ragged. Memories of our first date, our first kiss, the night I asked her to marry me, all of it felt like a lie now. A story I'd told myself to survive the reality of who she was, who we were. Tears blurred my vision, but I blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. I'd given her everything, and in return, she'd given me nothing but betrayal. When the doors opened at the lobby, I stepped out, my legs weak but determined. I didn't know where I was going or what I'd do next, but I knew one thing for certain, I couldn't go back. Not to that suite, not to that man, not to the woman who'd let him steal our marriage before it had even begun. My heart felt like it had been ripped from my chest, but at least I still had my dignity. And for now, that would have to be enough. I barely made it 5 steps down the hallway before I heard her voice behind me, echoing off the marble walls like a song I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Jace, please. Wait, she called, the desperation in her voice raw enough to make my chest tighten. I paused, every instinct telling me to keep walking, to disappear before she could pull me back into the trap we both let him build. But I couldn't move. My feet were planted on the cold tile, my heart pounding like a war drum. She reached me, her breath ragged, hair falling loose around her face. Her eyes shimmered with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were for me or for the man she'd left standing in that room. Why are you acting like this? She demanded, her voice trembling but tinged with anger, like I was the one who'd ruined everything. I turned to face her slowly, my jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack. Your father just walked into our honeymoon suite uninvited, Meera, I said, my voice low and sharp, every word slicing through the fragile calm between us. That's not normal. That's not okay. She flinched as though I'd slapped her, her eyes darting to the ground. He just wants to be part of the moment, she whispered. My stomach turned. Part of the moment? I echoed, incredulous. This isn't his moment. This is supposed to be ours. You and me, Meera, not you and him. And me playing third wheel in my own marriage. She shook her head, tears spilling over now. I can't just tell him no, she said, her voice breaking. He's all I have, Jace. He's the only family I've got left. My chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. And what am I then? I asked, my voice hoarse. Your husband, or just another piece in his collection of things he controls? Her lips trembled, but she didn't answer. That silence felt louder than any scream. I could see it now, clearer than I ever had. Meera didn't want to break free from her father. She wanted me to fit into the world he'd built around her. And in that world, I was a guest, not a partner. I raked a hand through my hair, the rage and hurt crashing over me like a wave. You never really planned on leaving him behind, did you? I asked. You never planned on building a life that was just ours. Her tears came harder then, her shoulders shaking as she tried to reach for me. No, she sobbed. No, Jace, it's not like that. I love you. I do. But I can't. She choked on her words, and I watched as she crumbled in front of me, the woman I thought I knew dissolving into a shadow of herself. I wanted to reach for her, to wipe away her tears and hold her, but every time I tried to imagine that life, Gerald's face loomed between us. His voice, his smirk, his possessive grip on her. And I knew I couldn't be a husband in a marriage where I'd always come second to her father. I took a step back, putting distance between us. I can't do this, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I can't be part of this arrangement you've let him create. Her eyes went wide, panic flaring in their depths. Jace, please, don't leave. We can work this out. He'll leave eventually. He just wants to make sure I'm okay. I laughed in it. A bitter, humorless sound that felt like it belonged to someone else. He'll leave. I repeated. Meera, he doesn't even know how to let you breathe without his permission. And you don't know how to tell him to back off. She reached for me again, but I pulled my hand away, the hurt in her eyes almost enough to make me break. Almost. I'm not going to spend my life fighting for scraps of your attention, I said. I deserve better than that. And so do you. She sobbed, pressing a hand to her mouth, her shoulders shaking. I love you, she cried. Please, don't walk away. Please. My heart cracked, but I couldn't let that break me. Not now. Not after everything. Love isn't enough, I whispered. Not if it means living like this. Her tears fell silently, her body trembling. I turned and walked toward the elevator, the weight of every step pressing down on me like the final nail in the coffin of everything I'd hoped for. As the doors slid open, I glanced back at her, eyes red, cheeks wet, a hand pressed to her chest as though trying to hold her heart together. For a moment, I almost went back. Almost. But then I heard his voice echoing from the suite. Meera, are you okay? Do you need me? The way she turned toward him, like a moth to a flame, told me everything I needed to know. I stepped into the elevator and let the doors close between us, the final barrier between the life I'd tried to build and the reality I couldn't escape. My chest felt hollow, my hands shaking, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might burst. I'd loved her. God, I'd loved her. But love couldn't survive a triangle with a man who refused to let go. As the elevator descended, I braced myself for the world outside, the one where I'd have to figure out who I was without her. I'd lost my wife. But maybe, just maybe, I'd found myself. I stepped out into the lobby, the marble floors cold under my feet and the air smelling like polished brass and fake orchids. I wanted to run, to leave the memories behind, but the concierge's desk loomed ahead like a final checkpoint. My hands trembled as I approached, fingers fumbling for my wallet. I needed a room somewhere, anywhere, just to get away from that suite. From him. From her. From the echoes of a marriage I'd thought was mine. The concierge smiled politely as I reached the counter, his eyes flicking from my face to the faint tremor in my hands. Can I help you, sir? He asked. I forced my voice to work. I'd like to book a room, I said, my tone ragged, the words heavy in my mouth. He clicked through his screen, fingers flying over the keys. I'm sorry, sir, he said after a moment. It appears your reservation was canceled earlier today. There's nothing available tonight. We're at full capacity. I blinked, the words hitting me like a slap. What? I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. I didn't cancel anything. This is my honeymoon. My reservation is under Jace Mitchell. He checked the screen again, his brow furrowing. Yes, sir, he said carefully. But the cancellation was made by Mr. Gerald Lennox this afternoon. He's listed as the primary on the reservation. My stomach dropped. Of course, Gerald had thought of everything. Even here, hundreds of miles from home, he still had his fingers on every lever, every switch, every detail. He'd canceled my reservation. My room. My escape. I took a step back, my vision swimming. There's got to be another room, I said, desperation thick in my voice. Anything. The concierge shook his head, apologetic. I'm truly sorry, sir. We're completely booked. I turned away, the walls closing in. My credit card, Meera had booked everything on the joint account. I reached for my phone, pulling up my banking app, but the screen was an ocean of red tape. Transfers held, joint account frozen until she signed off. My own funds, pitiful by comparison, wouldn't cover a single night in a place like this. I was stranded. Stranded in the hotel that was supposed to be my honeymoon suite. Stranded in a marriage that felt more like a hostage situation with her father as the warden. My chest felt tight, each breath like swallowing glass. I moved to a quiet corner of the lobby, dialed my bank, and waited on hold. The tinny music a mockery of the life I thought I'd built. Every ring, every click felt like another nail in the coffin. When the call finally connected, the voice on the other end was polite but distant. I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell, she said. We can't release the funds without both account holders' consent. It's a security measure. I wanted to scream, to tell her she didn't understand. That I'd just been kicked out of my own life. But she didn't know me, and she didn't know Meera, and she didn't know that the man who'd orchestrated all of this was sitting upstairs with a beer in his hand and a smile on his face. I ended the call and leaned against the cold marble wall, my body numb. That's when I heard his voice, smooth, confident, like he'd been waiting for this moment. Son. I turned, and there he was, Gerald Lennox, standing with his hands in his pockets, his posture casual but his eyes sharp. He looked me up and down, taking in my disheveled hair, my shaking hands, the defeat on my face. Where do you think you're going? He asked, his voice low. I stared at him, a million curses boiling under my tongue. Anywhere but here, I spat. He chuckled, the sound dripping with condescension. She needs you, he said, his tone slow, deliberate, like he was explaining something to a child. You can't just leave her. I stepped closer, my chest inches from his. She needs you, I shot back. She's always needed you. And that's the problem. His smile didn't fade. That's not a problem, he said. That's love. I shook my head, every word like a dagger in my own chest. That's control, I said, my voice breaking. That's ownership. And I won't be part of it anymore. He leaned in, his breath warm and close. You were never meant to be, he whispered. I stared at him, my heart hammering, my fist clenched. For a moment, I wanted to hit him, to make him feel the pain I felt. But then I saw the way his eyes glinted with satisfaction, like he wanted me to do it, to give him the ammunition to turn Meera against me forever. So I turned away, my pride the only thing left in my grasp. I'd lost the room. I'd lost my wife. But I wouldn't lose myself. Not to him. As I walked toward the exit, my steps slow and heavy, I knew this was the beginning of the end. I was alone now, alone in a way I'd never been. But at least, for the first time in years, I could finally breathe. I called a cab to the airport, my fingers fumbling with the screen as though it were made of ice. The lobby's glass doors hissed open behind me, the night air sharp and cool against my burning skin. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I couldn't bear to see Meera's eyes following me, or worse, her father's smirk of victory. As I stepped into the cab, the driver asked for my destination, and I muttered, "Airport," my voice barely more than a breath. I sank into the seat, my chest tight, my heart a raw, ragged thing that felt like it might stop at any moment. But even as the cab pulled away from the curb, I saw them. Standing by the terminal entrance, Meera's hair wild in the wind, tears streaming down her cheeks. And beside her, Gerald, arms folded, his face the picture of practiced calm. My heart stuttered in my chest, every nerve screaming to turn around, to run to her. But then I saw the folder in his hands, a neat manila envelope, thick with paper. I should have known he'd find a way to have the last word. He stepped forward as the driver slowed, his eyes fixed on mine through the glass. The cab stopped. Meera's voice was muffled, pleading, but I couldn't make out the words. The door opened, and Gerald leaned in, extending the folder like an offering. "Just read it," he said, his voice smooth, too smooth. My hands trembled as I took it, the weight of it like a stone in my lap. I flipped it open, scanning the words. A prenup. Signed by Meera. Not by me. My blood went cold. It said if I initiated the divorce before 1 year, I'd get nothing. No shared assets. No split of our joint account. Nothing. A trap, carefully set. And Meera. She stood behind him, her eyes brimming with tears. "It wasn't my idea," she whispered. "Dad said it was just to protect me." I wanted to scream, to tear the folder to shreds and toss it at their feet. But I couldn't. The truth was there, in black and white. It wasn't about protection. It was about ownership. Control. "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "It was to trap me." Gerald smiled, a thin, satisfied smile that made my stomach turn. Meera reached for me, but I pulled back, my heart breaking all over again. "Goodbye, Meera," I whispered. And with that, I closed the door, gave the driver a nod, and let the cab pull away from the wreckage of the life I'd thought I'd built. I watched the lights of the airport terminal blur and fade in the rearview mirror as the cab pulled away, the hum of the tires on the pavement like a lullaby that was anything but comforting. My chest felt tight. My heart ached with a kind of pain that felt too deep for tears. Myra's voice still echoed in my head. It wasn't my idea, but I couldn't pretend anymore. She'd signed the papers. She'd let her father dictate the terms of our marriage before it even had a chance to begin. And now, every word she'd spoken felt like a lie. Every promise. Every vow. The cab driver glanced at me in the mirror, his brow furrowed in quiet concern. "Tough night, huh?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The words stuck in my throat like glass. I turned my head to stare out the window, watching the dark sea merge with the night sky. Santorini had been a dream, a promise of a future I'd thought we'd build together. But in the end, it had become my prison, a gilded cage with Gerald Lennox as the jailer. When we reached the airport, I stepped out, my legs trembling, my breath shallow. The cold wind hit me like a slap, reminding me that I was free now. Free, but not whole. I clutched my small duffel bag like it was the last piece of me I still owned. Inside, my passport, a half-empty wallet, and the memories of a man who had believed too easily in love. I walked toward the departures board, the bright lights a blur of destinations and possibilities. My eyes searched for the next flight out, anywhere but here, anywhere that didn't carry her scent or his smirk. I found one. Athens. 1 hour. I bought a ticket without thinking, my hands moving on autopilot. As I waited, I tried to remember the good things, the moments before everything fell apart. The way Meera had laughed that first night in Austin, her head thrown back, eyes sparkling with a light I thought I'd never find anywhere else. The way she touched my hand in that cafe, the brush of her fingers like a promise that maybe, just maybe, we'd be different. But every memory now felt tainted, like a rose dipped in poison. I closed my eyes and let the tears come, silent and sharp, carving lines down my cheeks that felt like punishment. A voice crackled over the loudspeaker, calling my flight. I stood, my knees weak, and walked toward the gate. And then, just before I boarded, I turned back one last time, half expecting to see her running toward me, tears streaming, ready to fight for us. But she wasn't there. Of course she wasn't. Because in the end, she'd chosen him. She'd chosen the man who'd taught her that love was possession, that loyalty meant obedience. I took a deep breath, my chest tight but steady, and walked onto the plane. As the engines roared to life and the ground fell away beneath me, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. A dull ache remained, a wound that would take time to heal, but I knew one thing for certain. I'd lost a wife, but I'd gained my freedom. And maybe that was enough for now. Because in the end, love shouldn't feel like a cage. It shouldn't come with contracts and conditions. It should be the one place where you're free to be yourself. And if she couldn't give me that, then maybe it was time to learn how to give it to myself.